Welcome to the Voice of Retail. I'm your host, Michael LeBlanc. This podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Retail Council of Canada. The COVID era has brought with it many changes in consumer behavior and plenty of questions amongst retailers as to which patterns will stick. We are all also trying to understand how consumers view brands in the modern post-COVID-ish era and how broader political, social trends and economics impact brand respect, regard, and recognition. My guest on this episode to help answer some of these questions is Dr. Saul Klein, Dean of the University of Victoria Gustavson Business School. Saul takes us through the 8th annual 2022 Gustavson Brand Trust Index in a fascinating interview that merges research and decades of thoughtful analysis. The index reveals that Canadian consumers are more distrusting of dominant technology brands than ever before and reveals the top performers in the Canadian retail landscape and what powerful attributes drive categories of retail and retail brands to the top of the list.
One of the interesting phenomena that we see that keeps coming through, so of our 33 categories, retail brands are the strongest. So the most trusted brands in the country tend to be the retailers.
So welcome to the Voice of Retail podcast. How are you doing this morning?
I'm great, Michael. It's great to be with you.
Well, it is wonderful to have you on the mic. You know, you and I have something in common. I don't know if you noticed in our mutual LinkedIn profiles. We are both graduates of Rotman MBA programs.
I suspect I was a little bit before you. It was before it was Rotman.
Well, it was before, I looked, I think you were 82 or 83 and I was 91. So neither of us were part of Rotman. I think we were both in that building right beside Oisey, right? The old management building.
That's right, on St. George.
So, we've kind of jumped right in. Why don't we take a step back and tell the listeners a little bit about yourself, your field of study practice, your role at UVic, and for those not familiar, because I've got an international audience, tell us a little bit about University of Victoria.
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, so maybe we'll just kind of start in the middle and go backwards and forwards. As you pointed out, I was at the University of Toronto. I did my MBA and PhD there, PhD in marketing. Before that, I'd moved around a fair bit and continued to after that. As you can probably guess from my weird accent, I'm originally from Zimbabwe, left Africa in the mid-70s, did an undergraduate degree in Israel, moved to Canada, then to the US, to Singapore, to South Africa, and then back to Canada, moved to Victoria in 2001. At UVic, I'm currently the Dean of the Gustavson School of Business. And we like to think of ourselves as a niche business school, very much focusing on issues around organizational purpose, looking at how organizations build relationships with their customers, with their employees, with their investors, in a way that's playing a more positive role in the world. I've been dean for the last 10 years. Before that, I ran our executive education operations and was also head of our international business functional area.
Now, a couple of questions on your background. What brought you to Canada? Was it friends? What is it that, of all the places to go, how did you wind up here?
Well, originally I came to Toronto to do my MBA and didn't really know much more about whether I wanted to stay. I was in Toronto for 6 or 7 years, then left Canada, and then came back 20 years later, really at the point where we wanted to settle down. Victoria was a great place to be. Canada had lots of advantages as far as career opportunities, as well as a broader fit between what we were looking for and where we'd been so far. And I think I was able to bring my international background to bear pretty strongly in Victoria.
Now, did you always want to be an academic? Is that a path that early on was of great interest to you, or did you find yourself an accidental
I think it's one of those serendipitous discoveries. When I originally came to do an MBA, I had no intention of becoming an academic. Over time, though, as I started getting involved in some of the research, the PhD started looking more interesting. And then I began to see that academia really fit my lifestyle, my choice, the choices I've been making in my life. I wouldn't say anything was particularly well planned. It's really more a function of taking advantage of opportunities when they came up.
Well, let's talk a little bit about University of Victoria. As I said, I got an international audience, so give us a sense of geography. It's in the wonderful province of British Columbia, but how big a school is it? Just overall, a sense of the university.
So university as a whole is about 23,000 students. So a medium-sized university, comprehensive university, covers pretty much the full spectrum. The business school is around 7 or 8% of the entire university. We serve about 1,500 students a year and have about 60 faculty members. We deliver programs at all levels, a large undergraduate program, some specialized master's programs in global business as well as in management, an MBA in a variety of different flavors. And we have a relatively small PhD program in international management and organization.
We're here to talk about the 2022 Gustavson Brand Trust Index. But before we get to that, I can't have someone with your background and expertise on the mic and not talk about this period that we've just been in, this COVID period as it pertains to brand and thinking about brand strategy. I mean, I read research that talked about consumers, 40% of consumers tried a new brand. I mean, that's epic, right? I mean, you usually, these brands kick, fight, and scratch for a percentage of share. You had tremendous brand switching. Now, some of that brand switching was, I can't find my brand, so I'm going to try a different one, and suddenly I'm loyal to someone else. As you kind of cast your mind back and reflect to the COVID era, not that we're quite past the COVID era, but the heat of the COVID era, the past 2 years, what are your observations around brand, and does brand still matter, and brand switching? Were you surprised at anything? Give me some of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, and certainly I agree with you. This has been an incredibly turbulent time. I would say, though, that we've seen two almost opposing effects. On the one hand, we've seen that with all of the uncertainty around us, consumers have gravitated to some extent to the familiar. So those tried and tested brands that they're very familiar with, that they've used for a long time, they kind of reverted back to during the pandemic. And we saw, particularly as people were going out less, eating at home more, food products, food brands, that kind of resonated with people based on their long experience with them, were quite popular. At the same time, as you pointed out, the pandemic changed everything. It forced us to rethink how we live our lives, how we engage with organizations. And from that perspective, we did start experimenting, in some cases by choice, some cases by necessity, with a variety of different brands. Certainly technology brands became a bigger part of our lives. But also, as you alluded to, with supply chain shortages, often we'd go and find that we couldn't get the brands that we were used to, and we started experimenting with others.
I have another podcast with Steve Dennis out of the United States, and he's a retail strategist, and we were talking about this tremendous regression to the mean. I mean, our next episode talks about the myth of the great acceleration. You've heard, all the acceleration happened and e-commerce was shot through a cannon into the future of time. But it feels like as well, there's this counter narrative, this counter force where people are kind of getting back to the before time, almost. A lot of these things didn't stick. What do you think about that? I mean, right now we're kind of just observing, but it does feel like this regression to the mean is a pretty powerful force in our lives. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's part of it, but I also think there was something else fundamental going on, and that consumers were looking for a deeper sense of meaning in their lives, but also in their relationships with brands, and they started demonstrating more expectations for brands to play a bigger role. So in terms of the work that we were doing, we saw that trust was really built by the sense that the brands were playing a more positive role in society, that brands were seen as treating people well. And we saw a really strong resurgence in interest in how brands treated their employees. We saw brands that were playing a more positive role in society gain more traction. So I think overall there was a rising set of expectations, which the interesting question is that a trend or is that a cycle? Mm-hmm. Our view is that we actually are on the cusp of an evolution in the marketplace where we have moved from a very much product-based economy all around product features, reliability, quality, to a service-based economy where on top of those product elements, we've layered on the service elements. How does the brand treat us as consumers? How do they communicate with us? And now we're, as I say, on the cusp to this more purpose-driven economy where it's not enough to have good products, to provide good quality service, but you also need to be seen to be having a more positive impact in society. And we think that is the key shift that it might have been happening before the pandemic, but we think the pandemic has certainly accelerated that.
It feels like you're talking a little bit about the difference between table stakes and differentiators in a brand, right? Like, and those to me are always moving points. You know, what was once a differentiator becomes a table stake, and it just gets a little harder to find those differentiators. So the whole ESG, social responsibility at one point it feels like was a differentiator, but it sounds like you're thinking it's becoming more table stakes, yeah?
I think it's moving in that direction. And I certainly agree with you that it is a function of differentiation. So as we saw, brands have trouble differentiating themselves on the basis of their core product features, the service elements started to become more differentiators. As the service elements have become a bit more commoditized, we're saying that the next major source of differentiation is going to be coming from an organization's values. And unlike product or service attributes, values are very difficult for others to imitate. We can copy your product, we can copy your service delivery system, albeit with some difficulty. But it's very difficult for another organization to copy your values. And those we think are going to be the more sustainable basis of advantage going forward.
I guess we're kind of putting that to the test in our latest global crisis, the war in Ukraine, where there's a tremendous amount of attention, at least initially, and I think still the case with brands who are operating in Russia, right, to get out of Russia.
Yep.
Do you think that's a good example, good case study of how consumers are going to react, globally to a situation?
Yeah, very much it is. And again, it's part of that broader sense of expectation. And we saw almost a rush for the exit of brands operating in Russia. And it became toxic to be seen as doing business with Russia at a time when the Russian invasion of Ukraine was having such a horrific and devastating consequence. And people are starting to ask those questions, or to really expect brands to be asking those questions, is what are you doing to make the world a better place? Are you aligning yourself with issues or practices that don't align with my values as a consumer? If you are, I expect you to change, or I will change and stop doing business with you. And I think we're seeing brands respond to that in a very powerful way. At this point, I think there's more than 500 brands that have pulled out of Russia. Most of the major consumer brands have done so.
I guess you're going to be in the exception is going to be more and more noticeable. There is a handful of consumer brands and retail brands that are still operating in Russia. I think that it might come to the day where that's a big decision, right? I mean,
absolutely. And I think some of what's happened is a function of the ownership structure. And we've seen some franchises have
Aldo
difficulty pulling out of Russia because of their relationship with their franchisee. And the franchisor might have said, yes, we want to pull out. The local franchisee says, no way, we can't allow you to pull out.
Yeah, I'd imagine there's some kind of, rule in some kind of long franchisee contract that says, under certain circumstances like brand harm, I revoke your right to use my brand. But anyway, we don't want to go down that rabbit hole. It's probably a separate podcast. Anyway, let's get back to the 2022 Gustavson Brand Index. Let's first of all talk a bit about the tradecraft. How is it done? Who do you talk to? And what's the process behind the numbers? Then we'll get into some of the insights.
Yeah, great. So this is something we've been doing. This is our 8th year in a row. Each year we conduct a major consumer survey. We commission a market research house to collect the data. We survey a broad cross-section of Canadians about their views with respect to an increasing number of brands. So, for example, this last go-round, we collected data earlier this year on just over 400 national brands, surveyed around 8,000 Canadians to try get an understanding of not only which brands they trust, but why? And what are the drivers of trust? So for each brand, we have a battery of questions that get at those determinants of trust, and then we measure them using a kind of a net promoter score type of methodology, where index is based on the difference between the proportion of consumers who trust a brand versus the proportion who distrust a brand.
I see.
And this is all of these measures are taken after we've done a pre-screen for familiarity. So there's no point in asking people to talk about a brand if they're not familiar with it. Once we've assessed the familiarity, then we take them through this battery of questions.
How do you account for strong regional brands? So I had the great opportunity on the Food Professor podcast to interview the president of Saint-Hubert Chicken, which is just a cultural icon. It has tremendous regard and recognition scores. And if you talk to the average Quebecer, that would raise quite high. And there's examples of those across the country. How do you kind of net that, as you said, the Canadian brand, the national brands versus the really strong regional brands? How do you sort through that?
Yeah, so our core study only looks at the national brands. We have 402 national brands that have to be sold in several parts of the country.
Okay.
In parallel, we also do a subsample. We don't report it the same way. It's not part of the broader index, but we do measure regional brands, particularly in BC, but also in Quebec. And there we find a really interesting phenomenon where regional brands tend to be trusted more than national brands, and Canadian brands tend to be trusted more than international brands, which is really interesting because when we started getting into this work, we had borrowed some of the methodology from a research company in the UK that was doing brand trust work on a proprietary basis. They were finding exactly the opposite. In the UK market, global brands were trusted most, then national brands, and then regional brands. The Canadian experience is entirely the opposite.
The temptation, and let's get into the results, but the temptation for me as the person doing the interview is always to ask this question. It must drive you crazy. Why? Because you don't really necessarily get insights from the people as to why, but I'm still going to ask you, why do you think that might be the case? Is it a small country phenomenon? It's not like we're a shortage here in Canada of global brands. Any sense of why that might be the case?
Well, I think it's the real strength of the brands. So you identified some Quebec brands where there's a very strong affinity. They've customized their offerings very directly. And perhaps it has something to do with the regional disparities within Canada that might be larger than we would see, for example, in the UK. And again, the brands that do really well, the strong regional brands, are very powerful brands in their own right. And they're taking advantage of being local and building those local relationships to an extent that it's often very difficult for even a national brand, let alone an international brand, to customize their offerings to the same extent.
Saint-Hubert is such an interesting example because while their stores are located almost exclusively in Quebec, they have a grocery product line that's quite extensive. So you can actually find their Saint-Hubert pies or treats in groceries across the country. And that's one of the things I probed on when I was talking to the president. I said, it feels like pretty amazing to me because you feel like you would have to have locations close by in Vancouver to sell Saint-Hubert chicken, but their brand seems to transcend geography, right? It's a pretty interesting example. Anyway, I'm diving into one example, but take us through some of the results. I mean, I see charts about climbers and sliders and overall results and top performers. So take me through some of the highlights.
Yeah, so one of the things we do is we look at overall most trusted brands in the country, and then we look at most trusted brands in one of 33 different categories. And we try to understand what's driving that. Overall, what we've seen again in 2022, and this is following a pattern that's been established for a number of years now, is that the top-rated, most trusted brand in Canada is the Canadian Automobile Association. It's kind of interesting that we tend not to think of them as a consumer brand as such, but they're very powerful in terms of building relationships with their customers. And what's striking about CAA is they do extremely well in all of our across all of our attributes. So we measure trust as a whole, and then we measure trust with respect to the product features, the service dimension, and the value structure. And CAA does extremely well across all of them.
Now, is that because is that because they're showing up when you're in trouble? Like, when I call CAA, I'm locked out of the car, the battery's dead, and all props to CAA. There's always someone who's going to show up. Is it those two things?
It could be, but interestingly enough, when we talk to CAA, and there's a bit of art as well as craft here in which category they belong to, they actually see themselves as an insurance brand. So we compare CAA relative to other insurance companies, and there too, they do extremely well. So there is something about the way they communicate, the authenticity around them, and the fact that, when you have a problem, they come out to help you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, what else? What else did you see? I see some retail brands and the most trusted brands. I see Costco, Home Hardware, Mountain Equipment Company, Shoppers Drug Mart, so President's Choice, obviously.
So one of the interesting phenomena that we see that keeps coming through, so of our 33 categories, retail brands are the strongest. So the most trusted brands in the country tend to be the retailers, whether it's food, whether it's drugstores, whether it's home improvement. So, Costco has been a perennial top 3 brand, does extremely well on the functional product attributes, value for money, good quality, great customer service. Home hardware, very similar kind of profile. So I think what's happened is we've seen a shakeout in the retail space. And, people often talk about the Amazon effect. What it has done is it's forced the retailers to up their game. And they have had to provide a very strong fundamental reason for consumers to come into the stores. And if they can't do that, they won't survive. And we've seen the failure of many retail brands. So what we're seeing here are the survivors who are actually doing a really strong job.
Interesting.
One thing that relates to, and one of the interesting findings we're finding this year, coming back to Amazon, for example, is while consumers are using certain brands more and more, they're not necessarily trusting them. And that's the choice issue that we're going to be looking at very closely coming out of the pandemic. So we've seen, obviously, this massive explosion in the use of Amazon. But our trust rankings of Amazon have continued to go down. And so again, we kind of think that once people start feeling more comfortable completely returning to retail environments, that could be a bit of a problem for Amazon. We're seeing similar phenomena in terms of the big tech brands, where there's a sense that they're becoming too big, too powerful. And as consumers, we're worried about whether we're giving up too much of our privacy, whether they know too much about us, and there's concerns about antitrust and those issues coming in. So it's really interesting to see this paradox that some of the brands that we're using most, we're actually trusting least.
I look at the other part of the results, and for the listeners, at the end of the podcast, I'll ask you to point them to where they can find the results, which are out today. I see that the score change is interesting to me. So some score changes are fairly modest, up and down a couple of points. But I look at something like Band-Aid as a brand, and ranking last year was 19, now it's number 2. What accounts for that? Is that a COVID bump? What would account for that kind of magnitude of change in a brand?
Yeah, so I think it is partly COVID. It is that reassurance. So in a time of incredible uncertainty, Band-Aid is, this old, very reliable brand that doesn't let you down. They perform extremely well. So I think those are things that happen. Typically, we don't often see brands jumping up rapidly. We often see brands falling rapidly when there's a problem, and then we see slower recoveries. But we do have a few examples of the opposite.
Bose is one of those examples, which is interesting to me. in as much as just the backstory to Bose closed all their retail stores, which didn't close their distribution, but they went from 30 up to 6, but they closed all their stores. Maybe it was just because we were focused on the home. What do you think? Again,
I think so. So again, if you think about our shopping behavior during the pandemic, not having retail stores wasn't a big deal because we were buying online. So I think a company like Bose could actually take advantage of that. And again, superb quality of their products and the customer service associated with them is what gave them that big boost. And you could argue that Dyson would be somewhat similar, even though it's been in the top 10 for a few years now. They dropped a little bit this past year, but very small in terms of the actual score change. A very strong product-based brand.
Yeah. And, I was thinking back to what you said earlier in our conversation about brands that were part of your lives that you've trusted. I see Hudson's Bay on your climbers chart, up 6%. So it made the climbers chart. I guess that's, is that, they're executing well, but is that part and parcel of a familiarity of a brand and their format, again, during this somewhat unusual time, but just in the rough and tumble world of retail competition?
Yeah, and again, I think it is that phenomenon of comfort. An interesting brand that did quite well and got to the top of their category is one that we haven't heard a lot about in recent years, and that's Laura Secord.
Yeah,
it's still long established, very comforting kind of brand. Interesting. All right, so the last question for you: words of advice. You've shared tremendous insights, and it's great. It's great background. What's your advice to retailers as they think about their brands? I mean, as they think about what they should take away from their future, what they should think about. Well, that might have changed because it was a weird time in our lives versus what structurally has changed. Any advice for the listeners out there? Yeah, I think it's about understanding that consumers have a very broad range of interests, and it's not enough to just provide reliable, good quality products, or even to provide good service. Increasingly, consumers expect the brands that they're buying from to play a more positive role in society. And they're looking for that. They're looking for signals as to how well are you treating employees. Certainly, that was a big issue during COVID, where frontline employees were seen as essential workers. They expect you to be playing a positive role, responding to societal issues in ways that align with their values. Now, that's often a challenge because people have different values and organizations are often kind of pulled in different directions. But it does mean making choices and being authentic in what you're doing. The other thing that we've seen is it's not just lip service. So greenwashing doesn't pay off. The evidence will come out in the long run. But consumers do expect you to be making a difference.
Well, Saul, it's been a great discussion. Last question for you. Where can the folks go to find the results and see the results and learn more and maybe even get in touch with you?
For sure. So the easiest way is to just go to our website. Just Google Gustavson Brand Trust Index and you'll take us there. What you'll find are data about all of the brands that we've been talking about, as well as lots more. For the brand owners out there, please feel free to contact us. We're more than happy to provide additional insights, additional information. This is a non-commercial activity. We see that we all benefit when trust increases, and if there's ways we can help different brands boost their own trust scores, we're more than happy to provide them. So we'll develop customized decks for you, do a deeper dive into your own brand performance, all in the spirit of trying to help all brands do a better job.
Well, that's very generous. Well, Dean Klein, as I should call you, Saul is my alumni partner. Thanks so much for joining me on the Voice of Retail podcast. Great discussion, great dive into some great research. It's really interesting, and so happy that we had this opportunity to connect. And let's do it again next year, the next survey, and see how things move along.
Happy to do that. Thank you, Michael.
Thanks for tuning into this special episode of The Voice of Retail. If you haven't already, be sure and click and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform so new episodes will land automatically twice a week. And check out my other retail industry media properties, the Remarkable Retail Podcast, Conversations with Commerce Next podcast, and the Food Professor podcast with Dr. Sylvain Charlebois. Last but not least, if you're into barbecue, check out my all-new YouTube barbecue show, Last Request Barbecue, with new episodes each and every week. I'm your host, Michael LeBlanc, president of M.E. LeBlanc Company and Maven Media. And if you're looking for more content or want to chat, follow me on LinkedIn or visit my website at meleblanc.co. Have a safe week, everyone.